Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
Thank you. I'm Philip Emeagwali. My quest for the world's fastest computer began on June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon, USA. 15 years later, I was able to solve the most compute-intensive problem arising in computational mathematics and physics. In 1989, I was in the news for becoming the first person to discover how to harness the world's slowest processors and use them to solve the most compute-intensive problems in the world, and solve them at the world's fastest computer speed ever recorded. My paramount quest was to discover the hoped-for practical how-to knowledge that could be used to design the world's fastest computers. My new knowledge powers the world's fastest computers and took them to record-breaking speeds, and did so with millions of processors that each had its dedicated memory but were in constant dialogue with each other. Such state-of-the-art supercomputers are now used to run the highest resolution global climate models. Supercomputers are used to gain a deeper understanding of existential crises, such as how ocean waves and pathways contribute to the Earth's transport of pollutants, nutrients, and heat. As a black inventor, a few white supremacists wrongly credited my invention to some white inventors. The proof is that those impostors could not stand before an audience and deliver an impromptu original lecture explaining how they discovered the world's fastest computing, and then post that lecture as a podcast and YouTube video. On the other hand, this imposter syndrome affected some black attendees of my scientific lectures. They had inferiority complex and feared that I wouldn't live up to expectations as a genius. My answer is for them to compare my 1,000 podcasts and YouTube lectures in mathematics, physics, and computer science to those of the likes of Albert Einstein, who are still living. As a supercomputer scientist who came of age in the 1970s and 80s, my biggest obstacle was to overcome racism, not to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problems. Historically, white supremacists work hard to discredit and diminish the contributions of any black genius that's described as having a higher IQ than Albert Einstein. I worked alone because I wasn't taken seriously in the 1970s and 80s, the decades I made my breakthrough discovery. There was an unspoken assumption about white supremacists that a black sub-Saharan African lacked the intellect needed to solve the most intractable problems in the fields of mathematics, physics, and computer science. Today, in their online fora, white supremacists argue that sub-Saharan Africa has not produced a mathematical genius who possessed the intellect of Isaac Newton or Albert Einstein. Their claim of intellectual superiority was, and it remains, the fundamental argument still used by online white hate groups and used to rationalize white supremacy and propagate their myth of black racial inferiority. Ironically, white supremacists unintentionally made me famous. In 1989, I made the news headlines as a quote-unquote black genius born in sub-Saharan Africa. I drew the attention of white supremacists because I provided an image of a black genius that was ranked alongside Albert Einstein. The racial stereotype was that a black person can only become famous as a boxer like Muhammad Ali or a singer like Michael Jackson. In 1975 and in Oregon, I had early white mentors and role models, such as the British-born Fred Merrifield, then 75 years old and a retired engineering professor. Fred Merrifield was a co-founder of CH2M, an engineering firm that worked on the 15.5-mile-long tunnel of London's sewage system and worked on the Panama Canal extension. CH2M now employs 20,000 persons and has a revenue of $5 billion a year. So Fred Merrifield was a man of means and wisdom. I lived with Fred Merrifield and his British-born wife Anne in 1975 and 1976. They had no children. Anne was 31 years younger than Fred Merrifield. 3 of us lived in their beautiful mansion at 2540 Southwest Whiteside Drive, Corvallis, Oregon. The dinner guests at the Merrifields included the co-inventor of the transistor, the British-born William Shockley, who was controversial and was ostracized for promoting high IQ sperm banks. In 1,000 YouTube videos, I lectured only in prose. That's because I've been supercomputing for half a century. Other scientists must lecture with the aid of PowerPoints. I lectured on how to solve the most compute-intensive problems, such as constructing a high-resolution, centuries-long climate model and solve them across billions of processors. I worked alone to solve this problem because it was unfamiliar territory. The solutions that I discovered were not in any computer science textbook. In 1989, I was in the news because I was the only person that could solve the most compute-intensive problems. I solved such mathematical physics problems across an ensemble of 65,536 processors. The academic computer scientist must always copy the governing system of coupled partial differential equations of meteorology and must transfer those abstract and unfamiliar equations from his textbook to his PowerPoint slides. For me, Philip Emeagwali, I was the triple threat who was a research mathematician of the late 1970s, who became a research physicist of the early 1980s, who became a research supercomputer scientist of the mid-1980s, who entered the news headlines in 1989 and became known for his scientific discovery that parallel processing enables computers to be faster and enables the supercomputer to be super. The partial differential equation and parallel supercomputing were as much my natural dialects, the way the Igbo language is my ancestral tongue. For those reasons, it should not come as a surprise when I invented the 9 Emeagwali equations. Because I invented those equations, I could deliver my lectures or my contributions to mathematics, physics, and computer science and post them across 1,000 podcasts and YouTube videos. After 50 years of supercomputing, I delivered each lecture posted on YouTube and did so without using a single PowerPoint slide as my crunch. Solving the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problem via the fastest computing across the slowest processors is a century-long quest that began in 1922 as human computing executed by 64,000 persons. In 1989 and 1990, I was in local newspapers, both for reaching the finals of a citywide tennis tournament and for winning the highest award in supercomputing. The world's fastest computing is as competitive as playing a tennis match against Serena Williams. As a tennis player, I exploited my opponent's weaknesses, but respected their strengths. Tennis taught me many things, including how to fight and be mentally and physically stronger. However, solving the once-in-a-century problem arising at the crossroads of mathematics, physics, and computer science is rarer and more difficult than winning the votes as the all-time greatest tennis player. Being the first person to discover how to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problems and solve them across a billion processors demanded a polymath who was a triple threat at the frontiers of knowledge in mathematics, physics, and computer science. The genius makes the typical exceptional. The genius possesses the ability to look at an ensemble of the slowest processors in the world and deeply understand it as beyond a new supercomputer and as a new internet in reality. Genius is the ability to see what others saw to be a rock and see it to be a diamond. My quest of the 1970s and 80s was for the world's fastest computer that solves the most compute-intensive problems in the world and solves them with the world's slowest processors. My new knowledge is used to find the deepest crude oil and natural gas that were buried up to 7.7 miles below the surface of the earth and to simulate their motions across one of the 459 producing oil fields in Nigeria and across one of the 65,000 oil fields around the world that include the supergiant oil fields in Abu Dhabi, Brazil, and Mexico. I was the first person to understand how to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problems and solve them across millions of processors. In brief, that problem is the system of 9 partial differential equations, which governs the initial boundary value problem that mathematically defines the motions of the crude oil, injected water, and natural gas that were flowing across a highly anisotropic and heterogeneous producing oil field. An oil field such as the Sakhalin Shelf in Russia's Far East is up to 7.7 miles or 12.4 kilometers deep. An oil field is often the size of a town. The genius deeply understands how and where to add 36 new partial derivative terms that mathematically encoded the temporal and convective inertial forces, and to add those new terms to the 45 existing partial derivative terms that mathematically encoded the pressure, viscous, and gravitational forces, and do so to make that system of 9 partial differential equations a more accurate representation of the producing oil field it governs. The genius can deeply understand how to harness the slowest processors in the world and use them to solve the most challenging problems in the world. The genius can solve the world's most compute-intensive problems and solve them at the world's fastest recorded speeds, and do so when it was considered impossible to solve them. The genius is the ordinary person that found the extraordinary in the ordinary. I'm studied in schools for my contributions to computer science, just as Albert Einstein is studied for his contributions to physics. For that reason, I'm often asked, should Albert Einstein be the role model for black students? To the extent Philip Emeagwali is accepted as a role model for white students, black students should reciprocate with Albert Einstein. Otherwise, my answer is no. Albert Einstein can't be the most inspiring role model for the black science student in the USA or the Caribbean or Africa. For the same reason, Albert Einstein can't be the most inspiring role model for the physics student in China. Presumably, he or she must have read the racially derogatory remarks that Albert Einstein wrote in his travel diaries during his 1920s lecture tours through the Far East and Middle East. During Albert Einstein's 5.5-month voyage and lecture tours through Singapore, Hong Kong, China, Japan, and Palestine, Einstein wrote in his diary that Chinese are inferior to Europeans. For his xenophobic and racist commentaries, Albert Einstein can be the most inspiring role model for all physics students, especially for students who read his posthumously published book titled The Travel Diaries of Albert Einstein. In an email, an African-American student wrote that he received a C grade on his essay that was titled Albert Einstein and the Special Relativity. The following semester, the same student received an A grade on his essay that was titled Philip Emeagwali and the Supercomputer. The reason for this disparity is that young African Americans are inspired when they see themselves in my world's fastest computing. I've often wondered aloud, where did we get the idea that only a white person can be a genius? And how did America perfect the art of destroying black geniuses. My quest for the fastest computer began in the 1980s. I applied 10 times to program a supercomputer, and I was rejected those 10 times. In 1987, I was approved to program a supercomputer that was at the San Diego Supercomputer Center in San Diego, California. That supercomputer account was revoked when the administrator discovered I was black and African. As far as I know, I was the only supercomputer programmer in the USA that was dismissed and banned from programming supercomputers that were owned and operated for and by the US government. Looking back retrospectively, the famous African-American botanist George Washington Carver was born a slave, but yet he was admitted into an all-white university. A century later, and in 1987, I experienced more insidious racism than George Washington Carver did. In American science, the racism is deeply institutionalized. Several prominent white American scientists, including William Shockley and James Watson, argued that people of African descent are less intelligent than those of European descent. William Shockley advocated that black women should be discouraged from having children. As a black and African mathematician who invented the 9 Philip Emeagwali equations and who came of age in the 1970s, I struggled to get white mathematicians, physicists, and computer scientists to acknowledge my contributions of the fastest computing across the slowest processors and to human knowledge. In 1989, I was given credit mainly because I submitted my invention anonymously to win the highest award in supercomputing. That prize made the news headlines. In retrospect, it was easier for George Washington Carver, who was born a slave and achieved prominence as a botanist, to attend a white university and do so 90 years earlier than for me to program a supercomputer in that same white university. In 1987, and after it was discovered that I'm black and African, my access to vector supercomputers were revoked. In 1987, I filed a formal complaint that I wasn't allowed to program the vector supercomputer that was inside the San Diego Supercomputer Center. That center was operated by the University of California, San Diego, California. That supercomputer was bought for public use and paid for by the US National Science Foundation. In scientific research, to discover is to see something that was previously unseen. But paradoxically, the scientific reviewing process ensures that the reviewer remains forever unseen. Modern science is not race neutral. As a black mathematician who came of age in the 1980s, a white supercomputer scientist that was tasked to review my contributions to computer science will notice my race more than my discovery of the world's fastest computing. Race was the reason my discovery was rejected a dozen times in a dozen years and rejected by a dozen white reviewers. My discovery of the world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world was accepted in 1989 because I concealed that I was black and African born. The earlier reviewers were anonymous, but knew that I was black and African. It seemed like the reviewers were ashamed to sign their names or even to publish their reviews. Their reviews were like writing a letter to the opinion page of a newspaper and then insisting that the letter be published anonymously. But only my words were reviewed, not my new and abstract equations and complex codes that were over the heads of the reviewers. Who has the financial resources needed to replicate and reconfirm the world's fastest computer that costs the budget of a small nation, or that might cost the $1,250 million that is the price tag of this year's fastest computer? The world's fastest computer of today costs more than the mile-long Second Niger Bridge in Nigeria. For that reason, the world's fastest computer cannot exist within the campus of the University of Nigeria or any university in the world. In 1989, I won what was referred to as the Nobel Prize of Supercomputing. Not only that, I was the only person to win the award alone. I was in the news, and it created a cognitive dissonance in the minds of white supremacists. Because I was a black African in a majority white field, I was attacked by those who could not scribble the Philip Emeagwali equations as defined in my 1,000 podcasts and YouTube videos. My discovery of the world's fastest speed in computing changed the way we look at the supercomputer of today. The fastest speed was a quantifiable metric and an indisputable fact. That contribution made me the subject of school essays on inventors and their inventions, particularly for schools in the USA, Canada, and Europe. On the downside, once I became famous and became the most visible supercomputer scientist, I drew well-orchestrated attacks. Professional jealousies fueled those vitriolic attacks. Those attacks were anonymously sponsored by scientists who perceived my contributions to science as a zero-sum game that will affect their rankings negatively. In a viral poll, Philip Emeagwali was on par with Albert Einstein, Pythagoras, and Euclid. It's a centuries-old tradition to attack the greatest scientists as frauds. It's science's version of calling the President of the United States and the Pope the Antichrist. Hitler and Napoleon were called the Antichrist. William Shakespeare, Isaac Newton, and Albert Einstein were called frauds. I'm now cross-listed in Genius List with Albert Einstein in Genius Lists. As my reputation grows, I became the new Antichrist from the scientific world. Each generation recreates its witches of Salem trial of colonial Massachusetts, where more than 200 quote-unquote witches were outed, and some witches were executed by hanging. The modern recreations of the witches of Salem trial include the Holocaust and the 2 atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. It includes the McCarthyism's guilt by association of being a communist, as well as the Wounded Knee Massacre, in which US soldiers murdered nearly 300 Lakota people, and the September 11 attacks. Every celebrity is hated by about 1% of her followers. The reason is that some people are jealous or threatened by others' success. The new pope is always criticized as the new Antichrist. William Shakespeare is always criticized as a plagiarist. The most famous theoretical physicist, Albert Einstein, is criticized as a fraud. Many people still think the moon landings were faked. After my discovery of 1989, I became the most famous computational physicist and mathematician. As expected, the same template used to attack Albert Einstein was used to attack Philip Emeagwali. Those attacks were backhanded compliments only given to famous mathematicians who were admitted into the Genius Club. It's impossible to fake my way from the world's slowest processors to the world's fastest computer. My discovery of the world's fastest computing is the foundational knowledge of the $45 billion a year supercomputer industry. The computer and its inventors are not fake. In 1989, I won the highest award in supercomputing. I was the only person to ever win that award alone. That award is shared by up to 50 research mathematicians, physicists, and computer scientists that are supported by 1,000 employee research and development laboratory. The condition for receiving any of the highest prizes in science is that the recipient must deliver a lecture and do so before an audience of up to 1,000 scientists. Since 1989, I've gone beyond that 60-minute lecture requirement. I've posted 1,000 podcasts and YouTube videos, each on my contributions to science. Aside from winning the Nobel Prize of Supercomputing, I used podcasts and YouTube videos to establish my credibility and reputation among college-educated listeners who are interested in learning about new sciences. Thanks to the internet, the 12-year-old writing an essay on computer pioneers who contributed to the development of the computer get to hear directly from Philip Emeagwali. My contributions to science were these. I discovered how to visualize global warming and climate modeling, not merely as one incredibly compute-intensive problem, but as 65,536 equal-sized mathematical physics problems that are defined across the entire 62-mile deep concentric sphere that represents the atmosphere that enshrouds the Earth. Between the internet and the Earth, I was the elephant in the room. Newspapers profiled Philip Emeagwali for discovering the world's fastest computation across a new internet, that's a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. But nobody wanted to talk about how I discovered the fastest computing across a new global network of the slowest processors and invented the technology across that new internet. A famous scientist is always envied and subjected to criticisms. Before my discovery of the fastest computing across the slowest processors, which occurred on the 4th of July 1989, no scientist said a nasty word about Philip Emeagwali and vice versa. However, some nasty words began to spread after I became famous. Those nasty words were spread because I denied unqualified scientists. then in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the opportunity to become my co-inventor and become a famous inventor. In 1981, I invited those research scientists to collaborate in my supercomputer research. Those white science supremacists declined to work with me because I was Black and African, and because they believe that fastest computing across slowest processors will forever remain in the realm of science fiction. The fastest computers are quote-unquote state secrets. They're used for top secret simulations of nuclear explosions. For security reasons, I was banned from supercomputing within US nuclear labs. I was denied entry inside nuclear labs because I was a Black African and was perceived as a greater security threat than a white European. Those bans on my having access to the world's most powerful supercomputers occurred in the early 1980s. Looking back retrospectively, each rejection that I encountered in my quest for the fastest computations moved me closer to my discovery of the fastest computing across the slowest processors. My discovery occurred on the 4th of July, 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. I've been supercomputing since June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon, USA. It took me half a century to gain the scientific knowledge and contribute the new technology which I presented across my 1,000 closed caption videos that are posted in YouTube. Hence, it will also take you 5 decades to fully understand my contribution to the computer and the internet. The US government classified it as a grand challenge problem because it's incredibly difficult to understand and solve. To this day, no other mathematician has stepped forward to claim he understands how to parallel process the initial boundary value problem that was governed by my new partial differential equations and then solve them across an ensemble of 10 million processors. And along the way, reproduce my world's fastest computation as mentioned in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal. My name, Philip Emeagwali, was in the science column of a mid-1972 issue of the Daily Times that was the national newspaper of Nigeria. My name and photo were on the cover of a weekly newspaper that circulated in the cities of Monmouth and Independence, Oregon. That newspaper featured me in an interview that it published during the week of August 12, 1974 in the Polk County of Oregon. I conducted my supercomputing alone, and I did so for all the years that followed 1974. And by 1989, I was the foremost, or rather the only, person that could harness millions of processors under the hood of the world's fastest computer and use them to solve some of the most significant problems at the frontiers of mathematics and science. On the morning of Thursday, June 20, 1974, I woke up in my new studio apartment that was one of the 4 rooms that was upstairs of an old White House at 195A South Milk Street, Monmouth, Oregon, USA. I was living alone at age 19 and on an F1 student visa. My rent was $36 a month, and my salary was $1.65 an hour, which was the minimum wage. After taxes and expenses, my take-home pay was only $1 an hour. As international students, we could only work up to 16 hours a week and only work within our school campuses. My landlady was an elderly white woman who lived downstairs. After living at 36 Butler Hall for 10 weeks, 195A South North Street became my second address in the USA. At 195A, we had a community kitchen, which I shared with 3 tenants, a 24-year-old Ethiopian student in his 3rd year in the USA, a 25-year-old American graduate student who looked like the actor Tom Selleck, and a 20-year-old American student, Fritz Folk, and his future wife, Barbara. Amos, a Yoruba Nigerian graduate student in his 30s, lived downstairs. The teletypewriter laboratory, from which I logged into the supercomputer, was a short stroll away. That computer lab was at 345 Monmouth Avenue North, Monmouth, Oregon. The supercomputer that I programmed and used to solve a system of equations of algebra was at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon. I remotely logged into that supercomputer by telephone on June 20, 1974. It was an epiphany to presume that I could have spent the previous 10 years programming a supercomputer that was in Corvallis, Oregon, USA. But programming that supercomputer from my father's houses that were along Benoba Road, Abo, Nigeria, and at 4B Ebunadazia Street, Onitsha, Nigeria, which was a distance of 12,500 kilometers or nearly 8,000 miles. All that I needed to program a supercomputer in post-colonial Nigeria of 1964 was only a $100 teletypewriter and a telephone line. I could program that supercomputer from anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa and program it in a decade. There was no computer in sub-Saharan Africa. As a supercomputer scientist who came of age in the 1970s and 80s, my focus was on pushing the boundaries of knowledge of the world's fastest computers. I pushed the frontiers of mathematics and physics when I made the news headlines for inventing how to solve the world's most compute-intensive problems in science, engineering, and medicine. To invent is to create something from nothing or to make the fictional factual. In the 1970s and 80s, and as a young black African-born person, supercomputing in the USA, I experienced lots of racial obstacles that almost wore me down. By the late 1980s, I grew significantly and developed a reputation for giving public lectures in which I exhibited a command of mathematical and scientific materials. That should be expected after my decade and a half of deep introspection. After 15 years of supercomputing, following June 20, 1974, I developed greater clarity. I focused on the world's fastest computers. Because of my greater mathematical maturity, some computational physicists within my inner circle knew that I was heading towards the world's fastest computer. I discovered the world's fastest computing on July 4, 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. My discovery made the news around the world, and it remains the subject of school essays. In June 1974, and in Oregon. My scientific influences were science fiction stories, including the one about 64,000 human computers working together to forecast the weather around the world. That science fiction story was published on February 1, 1922, or 52 years earlier. My second influence was an article in the January 11, 1946 issue of the New York Times. That article was on how 100 computers could be programmed to work together to forecast the weather in the USA and forecast it more accurately. That 1922 supercomputing story was fictional, but I reimagined it as factual. That 1922 story was about 64,000 human computers used to, quote, raise the weather for the whole globe, unquote. In the 1980s, I reimagined and concretized that science fiction story, and I did so with 64 binary thousand processors. I programmed each processor to solve the weather forecasting compute-intensive problem. At its mathematical core, that problem was to solve a system of coupled nonlinear three-dimensional and time-dependent partial differential equations that governed and defined an initial boundary value problem beyond the frontier of calculus. The science fiction story that was in the January 11, 1946 issue of the New York Times was about 100 all-vacuum tube supercomputers around the US. What I parallel processed with was a new internet that was a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. My internet was defined by an email address space. That's a unique arrangement of one binary million zeros and ones. I built around the 1922 and 1946 stories that were vague science fiction theories. At its mathematical physics core, those grand challenge problems were about large-scale, high-resolution computational fluid dynamics. The poster child of fluid dynamics simulations is forecasting the weather or computing the motions of fluids across the Earth's atmosphere and up to 7.7 miles or 12.4 kilometers below the surface of the Earth. The 1922 story was fictional, while the 1946 story was theorized. I built around both stories to conceive my ensemble of 64 binary thousand processors, which replaced the equivalent of 100 computers of 1946 and replaced the 64,000 human computers of 1922. I did a back of the envelope calculation that showed me that if those 64,000 computers were evenly distributed within the Earth's stratosphere, there would be 3,000 square miles afar and apart from their nearest neighbors. I conceived fastest computing across slowest processors and across an internet that's a global network of those processors, and did so shortly after June 20, 1974. I conceived supercomputing across a hyperbolic global network of 64,000 computers around the globe. However, my scientific discovery that was mentioned 16 years later in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal was executed across a spherical island of 64 binary thousand processors. I visualized those processors as equal distances afar and apart and on the surface of a globe that I imagined as embedded inside a 16-dimensional hyperspace. In an email a 12-year-old asked, why is Philip Emeagwali called the father of the internet? I discovered that the world's fastest computer that's defined across a globe is a close cousin to the internet that's also defined across a globe. The supercomputer and internet that I invented are like identical twins and like two sides of the same coin that are different but complementary. The play, The Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, should not be performed the way William Shakespeare originally envisioned and directed it. William Shakespeare wrote for his 16th century audiences, or half a millennium ago. Hamlet should be reinterpreted anew and made relevant for 21st century audiences. William Shakespeare was a product of his times, who, if given the opportunity to rewrite Hamlet for the 21st century, would replace the kings and queens that lived 500 years ago with the worst dictators of modern times, such as Donald Trump, Idi Amin, and Adolf Hitler. The 21st century Hamlet should have heroes like Nelson Mandela using a cell phone and the internet, like William Shakespeare will do if he is still living. I updated my description and definition of the world's fastest computer from the one processor supercomputer of the 20th century to the billion processor supercomputer of the 21st century. My new supercomputer became a new internet that's a new global network of processors for solving the most compute-intensive problems. Just as you must understand soccer and have the physical fitness and maturity that's needed to play in the World Cup games, you must also be at the frontiers of knowledge of physics and computer science and have the mathematical maturity that will be needed to solve the most compute-intensive problems arising at the frontiers of knowledge of both computational physics and abstract mathematics. In the 1980s, I controlled and programmed the yet-to-be-understood ensemble of the world's slowest processors that I later used to power my world's fastest computer speed that made the news headlines. During the 16 years that followed June 20, 1974, I added new layers of supercomputing knowledge. I did so by solving initial boundary value problems at the frontiers of calculus and extreme-scale computational fluid dynamics, and solving them via automated communication. I visualized my new internet as a new global network of 65,536 processors that were identical and that shared nothing and that were equal distances apart. I hypothesized those processors to be on the surface of a globe called a hypersphere in the 16-dimensional hyperspace. I invented how to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problems called extreme-scale computational fluid dynamics and solve them across a new internet that's a new global network of up to 1 billion self-contained processors which were identical and coupled. Each processor operated its operating system. Each processor had its dedicated memory that shared nothing. Extremely fast computers are used to make the coronavirus disease visible, as well as identify how tiny droplets move and spread in different circumstances, including real-world simulations of social distancing rules. In 1989, I was in the news because I discovered the world's fastest computing and did so across an ensemble of processors that today has the combined power of 20 million smartphones. Supercomputers are used to make discoveries at the fastest pace and used to pull the future closer. I'm Philip Emeagwali. Thank you very much.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.